He signed the papers in front of everyone, not in a lawyer's office, not in private, not with even the smallest pretense of dignity. Damian Ashford had arranged it like a performance. Board members in pressed suits, foreign investors with their interpreters, underworld lieutenants who hadn't bothered to hide their weapons. 53 people crammed into the Blackwood Estate boardroom, and every single one of them watched as he slid the divorce documents across the mahogany table toward the woman who had been his wife for 7 years. He didn't look at her when he said it. "You were never made for this world." The room didn't react the way a room full of decent people would have. There were no gasps. A few of the executives near the back actually smiled. One man, Harlan Voss, chief financial officer, who had never once spoken directly to Vivian in 7 years, leaned over and whispered something to the investor beside him, and they both chuckled quietly behind closed fists. Vivian Sterling looked at the papers. She looked at them for exactly 3 seconds. Then she picked up the pen. "If someone did this to you, discarded you in front of strangers like you were a line item being removed from a budget, what would you do? Before you answer, stay with me. Because what Vivian did next took 7 years of silence to prepare for, and it is going to change everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and who actually holds the knife in a room full of dangerous men. Hit the like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because I promise you, you are not ready for where this goes." The pen moved across the signature line without hesitation. No shaking, no paw. Vivian Sterling signed her name the way she did everything, quietly, completely, without asking for anyone's approval. She set the pen down. She removed her wedding ring. Not with a dramatic gesture, not with tears. She simply pulled it off her left hand with 2 fingers, the way you'd remove a ring that had grown slightly too tight, and placed it beside the documents with a soft click against the mahogany. Then she stood up, picked up the single gray suitcase that she had apparently carried into the room herself. Nobody had noticed it until that moment, and walked toward the double doors at the far end of the boardroom. 53 people watched her go. She didn't look back. Not at the portraits on the walls, not at the men who had eaten dinner in her home for years without ever learning the names of her actual interests. Not at Damian, who was already turning to say something to the man on his left, before Vivian had even reached the door. She paused once, just at the threshold. Her voice was measured. She didn't raise it. "You'll understand why I stayed silent," she said, "when the truth finally reaches you." Then the doors swung shut behind her. Harlan Voss laughed again. "Cryptic exit," he said. "Typical." Damian picked up his own copy of the documents and handed them to his attorney without looking at them. He was already moving on. There was an offshore account restructuring to discuss, and the Mendez family representatives had been waiting 40 minutes. His marriage ending was, in his mind, the simplest thing that had happened to him all week. He would later mark this as the most catastrophic mistake of his 44 years alive. 22 minutes passed. The meeting continued. Numbers were discussed. Harlan presented a revised projection model for the Eastern Port operations. 2 of the foreign investors asked questions through their interpreters. Damian answered with the comfortable authority of a man who had never seriously doubted himself. Then Marcus, his head of perimeter security, stepped through the side door with an expression Damian had never seen on him before. Marcus Trent was not a man who showed expressions. In 11 years of service, he had delivered news of assassinations, ambushes, and financial collapses with the same flat professionalism. He had once told Damian that a rival syndicate had executed 3 of their mid-level commanders, and his face had not moved. His face was moving now. "Sir," Marcus said, "you need to come to the window." "I'm in the middle of—" "Sir." The second time he said it wasn't louder. It was quieter. That was worse. Damian pushed back from the table. The boardroom occupied the east-facing side of the second floor, and the tall windows looked out over the main approach road, the private lane that cut through 2 kilometers of manicured grounds before reaching the estate's iron gate. From up here, on a clear day, you could see all the way to where the lane bent around a stand of old oaks before disappearing toward the city. The rain was heavy, the light was gray, but you could still count them. One black Rolls-Royce Phantom appeared first around the bend in the lane, moving slowly, deliberately, with the unhurried momentum of something that has never needed to rush. Then a second, a third. By the time Damien's brain had registered what he was seeing, 6 had appeared, and they were still coming. 12. Identical, moving in perfect formation through the rain, their headlights cutting through the gray afternoon like a procession. No, not a procession. Something older than that. Something that carried its own kind of gravity, the kind you felt in your chest before you understood why. They stopped outside the gate. Men got out first. Not the drivers. The security. And Damien had spent his entire adult life around dangerous men. He employed several hundred of them. And he understood immediately, with a cold certainty that settled into his gut like swallowed iron, that the men stepping out of those vehicles were operating at a level he had never personally encountered. Not bodyguards. Not enforcers. Operatives. Their movements were precise without being theatrical. They fanned into positions with the unconscious coordination of people who had trained together so long that individual thought had been partially replaced by collective reflex. Some faced outward. Some faced the estate itself. 2 of them were already on earpieces scanning the roofline. They were scanning his roofline. In his driveway. The rear door of the lead Rolls-Royce opened. Vivian stepped out. She was still wearing the same understated gray dress she'd worn to the boardroom. She hadn't changed. She hadn't done anything with her appearance. But something about the way she moved across the 20 feet of wet gravel toward the gate, with the unhurried, straight-backed calm of someone who had walked into difficult rooms for her entire life, made her look like an entirely different person than the woman who had signed those papers 40 minutes ago. One of the men, older, with the bearing of someone accustomed to rank, stepped forward and said something Damien couldn't hear through the glass. Then he bowed. Not a head nod. Not a slight incline. A genuine, deliberate bow. The bow of someone showing deference to a person they considered significantly above themselves. "Welcome home, Lady Sterling." Damien didn't hear the words, but he read them. He'd always been good at reading lips. "Lady Sterling." He turned away from the window and looked at the 53 people still seated around his boardroom table. Most of them had come to watch him discard a woman they'd collectively dismissed as irrelevant. Not one of them looked comfortable anymore. In the hours that followed, Damien did what he always did when confronted with something he didn't understand. He started pulling threads. He called Garrison Cole, his intelligence director, a former government operative who had spent 15 years building Damien's information network from a collection of street-level informants into something that rivaled national agencies. Garrison called back in 40 minutes. The pause before he spoke told Damien everything before the words did. "The convoy," Garrison said carefully. "The vehicles are registered to a holding company called Sterling Meridian. The holding company is one of 9 subsidiaries connected to something called the Sterling Consortium." "I've never heard of the Sterling Consortium." "Most people haven't." Another pause. "Damien, these people, they don't show up in the usual places. Not in the databases I have access to. Not in the financial surveillance networks. Not in the intelligence community indexes I can reach." "What does that mean?" "It means either they're very new or they've been very deliberate about not being seen, and given the operational capability implied by what just parked outside your estate." Garrison stopped. "These aren't new." Damien sat with that for a moment. "Who is Vivian Sterling?" he asked. The question felt strange in his mouth. He had been married to her for 7 years. He knew her coffee order. He knew she slept on the left side of every bed, and that she had a habit of finishing books from the last chapter forward whenever she was stressed. He knew the way she laughed at things she found genuinely funny versus the polite laugh she produced for rooms full of people she didn't respect. He had apparently known nothing that mattered. "I'm still working on it," Garrison said. What I can tell you is that the Sterling family name shows up connected to operations on 4 continents going back to Damien. The earliest reference I can find goes back almost 60 years. 60. "I need more time." Damien ended the call and sat in the silence of his private office for a long moment. Then his phone rang again. It was the head of the Cortez family, who ran port operations across the southern coast and had been a reliable business partner for 9 years. "Damien," the man said. His voice was clipped. "Wrong. I'm afraid we're going to need to renegotiate our arrangement." "Renegotiate how?" "Suspend it indefinitely. My attorneys will send the formal documentation by morning." A beat. "I'm sorry, this isn't personal." He hung up. Damien stared at the phone. 20 minutes later, his secondary financial director called to inform him that 3 offshore accounts that had been invisible to every government and rival organization for 6 years, had been flagged and frozen by an authority that the director couldn't immediately identify. The calls kept coming. By midnight, Damien had lost 4 major contracts, 2 banking relationships, and the allegiance of a regional commander named Theo Marsh, who had served under him for a decade and who sent, in place of an explanation, only a brief text message. "I'm sorry. I didn't know who she was either." Damien didn't sleep. He sat at his desk with a glass of scotch. He didn't drink, and a growing document on his screen that Garrison kept updating, fragments of information, cross-referenced and pieced together from sources that kept drying up the moment they were accessed, as if someone on the other end was watching in real time and cutting the lines as fast as Garrison could find them. What emerged wasn't a complete picture. It was more like the silhouette of something enormous glimpsed through fog. The Sterling Consortium, privately held, no public-facing documentation, operating in financial infrastructure, intelligence contracting, and what Garrison's sources described obliquely as strategic consultation for high-value entities, active on every inhabited continent, no known leadership structure in any conventional register. Vivian Elise Sterling, second generation, educated in 3 countries, multiple languages. Garrison could confirm at least 4, possibly more. No criminal record, no public profile, no social media presence, no press mentions, nothing. She existed in the public record the way a ghost exists in a photograph. You could see the outline of a presence if you knew where to look, but nothing you could point to directly. And then Garrison sent through a separate file at 2 in the morning, flagged with a single word: assassination. Damien opened it. 8 incidents, documented, spanning 5 years. The first? A car bombing that had destroyed the vehicle Damien was supposed to travel in. He had been pulled out of it at the last moment by a logistics mix-up he had never fully understood, because by the time he'd thought to ask about it, the moment had passed. The second? A toxicology irregularity in a restaurant. The chef had abruptly changed the menu that evening for reasons that had seemed at the time like a professional whim. The third. The fourth. All 8. All intercepted. All neutralized before they ever reached Damien. Not by his own security, not by Marcus Trent's team, not by any apparatus he controlled. By operatives who appeared in the incident records under a single identifier, Sterling. She had saved his life, 8 times, over 5 years, without telling him, without asking for credit, without using it as leverage or confession or evidence of love. She had simply, quietly, efficiently, completely made sure he stayed alive. And he had signed divorce papers in front of 53 witnesses and told her she was never made for his world. Damien closed the file. He looked at the wedding ring sitting on the corner of his desk. He hadn't touched it since Marcus had brought it in from the boardroom hours ago. It was a simple band. Vivian had never wanted the elaborate designs he'd suggested. She'd chosen something plain, something that wouldn't attract attention. Of course she had. He picked up his phone and called her direct number. It rang 4 times. Then a voice he didn't recognize, male, professional, unhurried, answered. "Mr. Ashford," the man said, "Ms. Sterling is unavailable. She asked me to let you know that all future communication should be directed through her legal representation." A pause that felt deliberate. "She also asked me to tell you, and I'm quoting directly, don't apologize yet. You don't know the half of it." The line went dead. Damien sat with the phone in his hand. Outside, the rain had gotten heavier. Somewhere in the city, 12 black Rolls-Royces were carrying the woman he had underestimated for 7 consecutive years toward a life she had apparently been maintaining in parallel this entire time. A life with armed operatives and frozen accounts, and an organization that didn't appear in any database Garrison could reach. The door to his office opened. Sebastian Crow stepped in without knocking. He never knocked, hadn't in 20 years, and settled into the leather chair across the desk with the comfortable ease of a man who considered this room partly his own. He was 61, silver-haired, and possessed the kind of face that communicated trustworthiness so naturally that Damien had never once thought to question it. Sebastian looked at the Scotch glass, then at Damien's face. "Rough night," Sebastian said. "She's not who I thought she was." Sebastian nodded slowly. The nod of a man absorbing news, processing it, preparing a response. The convoy was dramatic. It wasn't drama, Damien said. It was a statement. What kind of statement? Damien looked at him across the desk. Sebastian's expression was calm, sympathetic even. The expression of a trusted advisor who had seen Damien through difficult nights before and would see him through this one. The kind, Damien said slowly, that I don't fully understand yet. Sebastian held his gaze. Then we figure it out, like we always have. He reached over and picked up the scotch glass, nudged it closer to Damien's hand. Get some sleep. It'll look different in the morning. Damien nodded. Sebastian left. Damien sat alone in his office and looked at the file on his screen. The 8 incidents, the 5 years of invisible protection. Don't apologize yet. You don't know the half of it. He believed her. What he didn't know, what wouldn't become clear for another 72 hours, was that the man who had just told him to get some sleep had been the one orchestrating every threat she had quietly dismantled, and that Sebastian Crow had been counting on Damien never finding out. The morning came in gray and wrong. Damien hadn't slept. He'd sat at that desk until the sky outside shifted from black to the particular colorless pale of early dawn, and when his housekeeper knocked at 6:15 to ask if he wanted coffee, he realized he'd been staring at the same page of Garrison's report for approximately 90 minutes without reading a single word. Black, he said. Leave it outside. He heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the approach road. Empty now. The rain had stopped sometime in the small hours, and the gravel was still dark with moisture, still holding the tire tracks where 12 identical vehicles had carved their slow procession through the wet. He could count the tracks if he wanted. He didn't want to. His phone had 47 unread messages. He read 3 of them, then put the phone face down on the desk. The third one had been from Harlan Voss, sent at 4 in the morning, and it said, "We need to talk today. Not tomorrow. Today. Things are moving that you need to know about. No elaboration." Harlan, who had chuckled in the boardroom. Harlan, who had been sending panicked messages at 4 in the morning. Damien picked the phone back up and called Marcus. Marcus answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't slept either. "Tell me what you have," Damien said. "Theo Marsh isn't the only one." Marcus's voice was careful, controlled, but there was something underneath it. Not fear exactly, more like the particular tension of a man who has spent 11 years building something and is now watching cracks appear in the foundation. "I've been talking to the regional leads since midnight. 3 more have gone quiet. Not openly switched, just gone quiet, which is almost worse because I can't account for where their loyalties are sitting right now." "Which 3? Marcus named them. Damien knew all 3, had sat at tables with all 3, had trusted all 3 with information that could have been used against him a dozen different ways over the years. "And the Eastern Port," Marcus continued. "The Cortez withdrawal wasn't just a contract decision. I talked to someone inside their operation an hour ago, off the record. They were contacted, directly contacted, by a representative of something called Sterling Meridian 2 weeks ago. They were given documentation, financials, communications records, operational details from our arrangement that only the Cortez family and our own people should have had access to." The word landed in Damien's chest like something physical. "She fed them our internal documents," he said. "The documents were accurate, current. Whoever prepared them had access to material from inside this organization within the past 60 days. The silence between them lasted several seconds. "That's not possible," Damien said, and even as he said it, he understood it was exactly possible. It was not only possible, but had apparently already happened, and the part of him that was still running on pride and shock was the only part that found it impossible. "I know," Marcus said. "I know it's not. But the documents exist." Damien ended the call. He stood in the center of his office and let the full weight of the previous night settle on him properly for the first time. Not the injury to his ego, not the spectacle of the convoy, not the strangeness of Garrison's file on 8 intercepted assassinations, but the actual, practical, operational reality of what was happening to his organization right now, in real time, while he stood here sleepless and still wearing yesterday's shirt. Vivian had been inside his organization for 7 years. She hadn't just been inside it. She had been inside it with her eyes open. Harlan Voss arrived at 9 o'clock, let himself in through the main entrance with the familiarity of someone who had done it 1,000 times, and found Damien in the east sitting room rather than the office. Damien had moved there because he needed to be somewhere without the file still open on his screen, somewhere that didn't have Garrison's clinical documentation of near death sitting in his peripheral vision. Harlan looked terrible. How was a man who normally presented himself with the aggressive polish of someone trying to convince the room he belonged in it, and this morning that polish was entirely absent. His tie was loose. There was something around his eyes that suggested he'd been running calculations all night and hadn't liked any of the answers. He sat down across from Damien without being invited. "The Nakamura group called me at 3 this morning," Harlan said. "Personally, not their legal team, Kenji Nakamura himself." Damien said nothing. "They're pulling out of the infrastructure deal, the 12-year deal, the one we spent 8 months negotiating." Harlan leaned forward. "Damien, that deal was worth more than everything else on our books combined. If they walk, why are they walking?" Harlan's jaw tightened. Kenji said they'd received information. That's all he'd say. Information that caused them to reassess the risk profile of continued association with the Ashford Syndicate. He paused. He used the word unacceptable. What information? He wouldn't specify, but the timing... Harlan stopped, recalibrated, looked at Damien with something that was almost accusatory, as if he was trying to decide how directly he could say the next thing. "Vivian, whatever she is, whatever that convoy meant, Damien, she didn't wait 24 hours. She hit us the same night. I know." "You know." Harlan's voice climbed slightly. "You sat at that table and signed those papers and you didn't know what she was, and now we're looking at the potential collapse of..." "Harlan." Damien's voice was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that didn't get louder, and Harlan, who had known him long enough, recognized it and stopped. "What do you need me to do?" Harlan asked after a moment. "Nothing yet. Get out of my house. I'll call you." Garrison arrived at 10 with a laptop, a secondary hard drive, and the expression of a man who had not eaten anything since the previous morning and had stopped caring about that fact around 2 in the morning. He sat across from Damien at the kitchen table. Not the office, not the boardroom, the kitchen table, which was the most unguarded room in the estate and the one least likely to have been compromised, and opened the laptop. "I found her," Garrison said. "Tell me." "The Sterling Consortium is real, and it is not small. I've been trying to map its structure, and I keep running out of edges. Every time I find the perimeter of something, there's another layer behind it. But what I can tell you with confidence is this. The consortium operates as a silent infrastructure layer across at least 11 national economies. They don't own visible companies. They own the companies that own the companies. They control access to financial channels, intelligence pipelines, and distribution networks that other organizations depend on without knowing who controls them." Damien was quiet. "Vivian's father built the foundation of it. He died 11 years ago, which is approximately 2 years before Vivian appeared in your life." Garrison pulled up a document. "She didn't marry you by accident, Damien, and she didn't marry you for love, at least not initially. I can't speak to what developed over 7 years. I'm not in that business. What I can tell you is that the match was strategic. The Ashford Syndicate controlled eastern port access and 3 overland corridors that the consortium needed and didn't have an elegant way to acquire directly. The words were clean and clinical, and they hit Damien like a sequence of small controlled detonations. "She married me for the corridors," he said. "She married into your operation for access." Garrison met his eyes carefully. "But here's what doesn't fit that narrative cleanly. The 8 assassination intercepts I documented last night, that wasn't strategic, or if it was wildly inefficient. You would have been easier to replace than to protect repeatedly over 5 years. If she only wanted the corridors, letting you die and managing your succession would have been simpler. So what does that mean?" "It means I don't know." Garrison pushed the laptop slightly across the table. "What I know is what she did. What I can't tell you is why." Damien looked at the screen. At the organizational map Garrison had constructed, incomplete, full of gaps and question marks, but already vast enough that looking at it produced a particular kind of vertigo, the vertigo of discovering that the room you thought you were standing in is actually a small compartment inside a much larger building you didn't know existed. "There's something else," Garrison said. He hesitated, and Garrison never hesitated, which meant what came next was something he'd been deciding how to say since he walked through the door. Say it. I found a reference to Sebastian. The kitchen went completely still. What kind of reference? Financial, indirect, routed through 4 intermediate entities, which is why it took me until 3 in the morning to find it. But there is a payment trail from a Sterling Meridian subsidiary to a holding company that Sebastian controls personally, not the syndicate, personally. Garrison slid a printed page across the table. The first payment was 6 years ago. Damien picked up the paper. He looked at the figures, the dates, the account identifiers. He had known Sebastian Crow since he was 22 years old. Sebastian had found him running a mid-level operation with ambition and no infrastructure, had seen something in him that no one else had bothered to look for, and had spent 20 years teaching him how to build an empire. There were decisions Damien made by instinct that were actually Sebastian's reasoning so deeply absorbed they had become indistinguishable from his own. This could be explained, Damien said. It could, Garrison agreed. I'm not telling you what it means. I'm telling you what I found. Damien set the paper down. Does Sebastian know you found this? No one knows I've found this. I haven't discussed this with anyone except you. Keep it that way. Sebastian called it noon. Lunch, he said. The usual place. I need to talk through the Nakamura situation with you. The usual place was a restaurant in the financial district that Sebastian had favored for 30 years. Private booths. Staff who had been working there long enough to understand that conversations at certain tables were not conversations they had heard. Damien had held a dozen sensitive meetings there. Fine, Damien said. 2 o'clock. He called Marcus immediately after. I need 2 of our best people inside that restaurant before 1:30. Civilians. I want ears on the table beside the corner booth. A pause. Are we monitoring Sebastian? I need to know if he has anyone in there before I arrive. Another pause, longer this time. Marcus understood what wasn't being said, and Damien could hear him adjusting to it in real time. The shift of an 11-year loyalty trying to accommodate a suspicion it hadn't previously had to carry. I'll handle it, Marcus said. Oh. The restaurant was half full when Damien arrived at 2:15, deliberately late. Sebastian was already in the corner booth, a glass of sparkling water in front of him, reading something on his phone with the unhurried patience of a man who had been waiting for people for decades and had made his peace with it. He looked up when Damien sat down. You look like hell, Sebastian said. I didn't sleep. Understandable. Sebastian set his phone face down. This Nakamura situation is manageable. I spoke to a contact who has a relationship with their compliance division. Where were you last night? Damien asked. Sebastian paused. Just slightly. Just enough. At home. You know I keep early hours. You called me from your landline at 11:40 to check in. Then what? Sebastian studied him across the table. His expression didn't change. It was still the warm, considered face of a trusted mentor. But something behind the eyes did something subtle that Damien might not have noticed yesterday. Today, he noticed. I went to sleep, Sebastian said evenly. Damien, what is this? The Cortez family was contacted 2 weeks ago by a representative of the Sterling Consortium. They were given documentation from inside this organization. Internal documentation. Damien kept his voice level. Who knew about the Cortez arrangement in enough detail to produce those documents? Several people. Harlan. Your Eastern logistics team. Myself. Sebastian's voice was measured. And apparently Vivian, since she had access to your home and your private communications for 7 years. The documents were current within 60 days. Then she had current access within 60 days. That's not surprising, Damien. She lived here. It was reasonable. Every word of it was reasonable. And Damien had spent 20 years learning to trust this man's reasonable words. There's a payment trail, Damien said. From a Sterling Meridian subsidiary to a holding company in your name. 6 years ago. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Sebastian picked up his water glass, took a sip, set it back down with the careful placement of someone buying themselves 2 additional seconds of processing time behind the cover of a mundane action. That, Sebastian said finally, is going to require some context. I'm listening. 6 years ago, I was approached by a representative of the Sterling family. Before I knew anything about Vivian, before she was in your life, before any of this. They offered me a consultancy arrangement, completely separate from my work with you. Strategic advice on certain European operations. I should have disclosed it. He met Damien's eyes. I didn't, because at the time it seemed irrelevant, and once Vivian appeared, I was concerned about how it would look. It looks like you've been on their payroll while working for me. A single consultancy, years ago, which I ended when the conflict of interest became apparent. Sebastian's voice was patient, almost gentle. Damien, think about what you're suggesting. 20 years, everything I've built with you. You think I would? I think I'm going to need documentation, Damien said, of the arrangement, when it ended, everything. Something moved across Sebastian's face, gone before it fully formed. Of course, I'll have it to you by tomorrow. Today, Damien said, by 6. Sebastian looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. By 6, he said. The documentation arrived at 5:50. Garrison spent 40 minutes examining it. It's good, he'd told Damien over the phone. It's very good, professionally constructed. The termination date is internally consistent, and the supporting records are clean. But it was assembled recently. The metadata on 2 of the supporting files shows creation dates from this week. A pause. He built it today, Damien, after your lunch. Damien sat with that for a moment. He knew we were monitoring the restaurant, Marcus said from the doorway. He had been standing there listening. His face was carrying something it had never carried in 11 years, something that sat between fury and grief, and he wasn't bothering to conceal it. One of our people reported that Sebastian made 2 calls from the booth before you arrived, short calls. We couldn't get audio in time. He made us, Damien said. He made us, Marcus confirmed. The 3 of them stood in the office in silence. Outside, the afternoon was fading toward another gray evening, and somewhere across the city, Vivian Sterling was, what? Moving pieces on a board that Damien still couldn't fully see, watching to find out what he would do next, waiting for something to happen that she had already predicted would happen? Don't apologize yet, you don't know the half of it. His phone rang, unknown number. He answered it anyway. Mr. Ashford. A woman's voice. Not Vivian, professional, neutral. I'm reaching out on behalf of Ms. Sterling. She has information she believes is relevant to decisions you may be making in the next 24 hours. She is willing to share it through a secure channel on the condition that you agree not to attempt direct contact or approach. What kind of information? The kind that concerns Sebastian Crow. A pause. The kind that will explain why she didn't warn you when she had the opportunity, and why she is warning you now. Damien looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back. What does she want in return? Damien asked. Nothing, the woman said. Not yet. The package arrived by courier 40 minutes later. A single encrypted drive. Garrison cracked the encryption in 20 minutes and stood back from the screen with the expression of a man who had spent his career accumulating things that disturbed him and had just found the entry that topped the list. Damien, he said quietly. Damien came around his desk and looked at the screen. The files on the drive detailed 22 years of Sebastian Crow's activities, not just the consultancy arrangement, not just the payment from Sterling Meridian, the full record, every double-sided dealing, every piece of information sold to rivals, every strategic recommendation that served Sebastian's interests rather than Damien's while appearing to serve both. The assassination attempts, all 8 of them, traced back not to Damien's enemies in the conventional sense, but to orders originating from Sebastian himself, routed through 4 intermediaries, contracted to outside operators. He had tried to have Damien killed, 8 times, and Vivian had stopped it, 8 times, without telling Damien, without telling anyone. At the bottom of the file, a single document, a timeline, beginning from 22 years ago, when Sebastian had identified a young, ambitious, infrastructure-rich criminal operation and decided that the most efficient way to eventually control it was to spend 2 decades becoming indispensable to the man who ran it. His ultimate objective wasn't documented in explicit language. It didn't need to be. The trajectory of 22 years pointed in one direction only. The Ashford Syndicate, hollowed out from within, transferred to Sebastian's control through a combination of strategic isolation and, if necessary, the elimination of the one person who stood between Sebastian and absolute authority. That person had been Vivian, which was why he had spent years subtly, patiently, persistently working to drive Damien away from her. Every comment about her silence that had been framed as concern, every suggestion that she didn't understand his world, every gentle observation that a man of Damien's stature needed a partner who could engage with his world rather than stand quietly at its edges. 20 years of trust, built to be spent on this. Damien stepped back from the screen. His hands were not shaking. He noticed that with a kind of detached surprise. He had expected them to be shaking. Instead, they were very still, and the stillness was the kind that comes not from calm, but from the moment after a very loud sound when the air is still vibrating and the body hasn't decided yet whether to run or stand. "Where is Sebastian right now?" he asked. Marcus had his phone out already. He made a call, waited, made another. His face shifted through several things rapidly and then settled into something hard and flat. "He's gone," Marcus said. "Left his apartment 2 hours ago. His car is at the airport, but he didn't board any commercial flight. We checked." "Private terminal?" "Nothing logged, but that doesn't mean nothing moved. The implications of that: Sebastian running, Sebastian with a head start, Sebastian who had spent 22 years building contingencies, landed with the full weight of everything Damien had failed to see for 2 decades. He picked up his phone to call Garrison and then stopped. From somewhere below the office window came a sound. Not loud. A single flat crack, the kind that people who grew up around weapons recognized immediately as a suppressed gunshot, followed in rapid succession by 2 more, and then the deeper percussion of something heavier. The lights in the office went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, red-tinged, dim, throwing everything into harsh shadow. Marcus was already moving toward the door with his weapon drawn, speaking rapidly into his earpiece, and from downstairs Damien could hear shouting, multiple voices, the crash of something heavy being overturned, and beneath all of it the sound of boots. Too many boots, too coordinated, moving through the ground floor of his home with the purposeful geometry of people who had studied the floor plan in advance. Marcus turned back from the doorway with an expression Damien had genuinely never seen on him before. "We have a breach," Marcus said. "Multiple entry points. East wing, main entrance, and the service corridor." He paused. "Damien, this isn't a robbery. The power cut, the synchronized entry points, the timing, 20 minutes after Sebastian's disappearance was confirmed. This wasn't opportunistic. This had been scheduled. And Sebastian, who knew the floor plan of Blackwood Estate as well as anyone alive, had made 2 phone calls from a restaurant booth this afternoon before Damien arrived for lunch." "How many?" Damien asked. "At least 12 inside the perimeter already. Could be more." Marcus moved to the desk, pulled the secondary weapon from the drawer where it had lived for 6 years without ever being used, and held it out to Damien. "There's a secondary exit through the east corridor behind the library. If we move now..." The office door came off its hinges. 4 men entered in rapid sequence, spreading immediately, angles already covered before the first one had fully cleared the frame. Professional, drilled, calm. The kind of calm that was more frightening than aggression because it meant they had done this before and expected it to go a particular way. The one in front looked at Damien. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "please come with us." Marcus raised his weapon. The man looked at him without concern. "Mr. Trent," he said, "I'd advise against it. There are 9 of my people on the floor below and 3 more coming up the east stairwell. You're a professional and I respect that, but the math isn't in your favor tonight." Marcus held the aim for 2 full seconds. Then, slowly, he lowered it. Because the man was right, and because in the red-tinged emergency lighting of the ruined office, with the sounds of his organization being systematically walked through below him, and Sebastian Crow 2 hours ahead of them somewhere in the city, Damien Ashford looked at the men who had just taken his home and understood, with a cold and absolute clarity, that everything Sebastian had built toward for 22 years had just arrived at its final act. And Damien was standing at its center with no allies. He could confirm were still his, no infrastructure he could confirm was still intact, and the evidence of the only person who had ever actually been protecting him, sitting on a drive on the desk behind him, delivered by the woman he had divorced in public 40 hours ago. He had no moves left that Sebastian hadn't anticipated, except possibly one. The man gestured toward the door. Damien went. They put him in a car, not one of his own, a black SUV with tinted glass and interior that smelled of industrial cleaner and something underneath that, Something older and more specific that Damien's brain identified before he consciously decided to identify it. People who spent time around violence knew that smell. It lived in upholstery. It didn't wash out completely. His hands weren't restrained. That was the first thing he cataloged. His phone had been taken at the office door, but his hands were free, and the man who had spoken, the one who had done the math out loud for Marcus, was sitting in the front passenger seat without looking back, which either meant he was supremely confident in the control of the situation or he was performing confidence for Damien's benefit. Damien couldn't tell which. He was too tired to tell which. Marcus was in the vehicle behind. They'd separated them deliberately, not aggressively, not with any drama, just a calm redirection at the base of the stairs. One of the other men stepping smoothly between them with a hand gesture that somehow communicated this way without being a shove. 11 years and Marcus had gone into a separate vehicle without being able to do anything about it, and the look he'd sent Damien over his shoulder was the look of a man filing away a debt he intended to collect. The city moved past the tinted windows. Damien watched it and tried to think. Sebastian had made 2 calls from the restaurant. One of them had almost certainly initiated tonight's operation. The timing was too precise for anything else. 40 hours from the divorce, and Sebastian had moved. Which meant Sebastian had been ready to move for longer than 40 hours. Which meant the divorce itself, the public spectacle of it, the boardroom full of witnesses, had been a trigger that Sebastian was waiting for. Something he had been pushing toward. Something he had manufactured. He was the one who suggested the public setting. The thought arrived with the particular cold clarity of a truth that had been available for weeks and simply hadn't been looked at directly. 3 weeks ago, when Damien had told Sebastian he was ending the marriage, Sebastian had said, "Do it where it counts. You need your allies to see that you're decisive. The boardroom. Make it formal." And Damien had thought it was strategic advice, had filed it under 20 years of strategic advice that had mostly been correct. It hadn't been advice. It had been staging. Sebastian needed the divorce to be public and witnessed because Vivian's departure needed to be confirmed. Her removal from the estate, her removal from proximity to Damien, her removal from the position of access that she'd held for 7 years. Once she was publicly out, Sebastian's operation could move. As long as she was in the house, he couldn't be certain she wouldn't intercept whatever came next. She had been the variable Sebastian couldn't fully control. So he'd used Damien to remove her, and Damien, who had considered himself the most dangerous man in 3 territories, had done exactly what Sebastian needed him to do without asking a single question. The SUV stopped. The building was industrial, not abandoned, operational, but not in any way that involved regular foot traffic. Loading dock infrastructure on the exterior, the kind of place that appeared on no interesting maps and attracted no interesting attention. Damien had owned 3 facilities like this himself over the years. They walked him inside. The interior was better lit than the exterior suggested, with the temporary infrastructure of a space that had been equipped deliberately rather than organically. Cables running along the floor, portable lighting rigs, communications equipment along one wall that Damien's eye cataloged as several significant tiers above anything his own operation ran. In the center of the space, 2 chairs. Sebastian Crow was sitting in one of them. He looked, at first glance, exactly as he always looked. Silver hair, composed posture, the face that communicated trustworthiness. But there was something different in the set of his shoulders. Something that had been held back for 22 years and was no longer being held back because it no longer needed to be. He looked relieved. That was the word. And it was the most disturbing thing Damien had seen in 48 hours of disturbing things, because it confirmed that the performance was over, and what was sitting across from him now was the actual Sebastian Crow, unfiltered, for the first time in 2 decades. "Sit down, Damien," Sebastian said. Damien sat. He looked at Sebastian for a long moment. At the face he had trusted with everything, strategy, money, lives, the whole architecture of what he'd spent 20 years building. He tried to find in that face some evidence of the man he'd thought was there. A remnant, an inconsistency. Something that indicated that the file Garrison had spent the night assembling was wrong, or incomplete, or capable of a different interpretation. He found nothing. "How long did you know I was watching you?" Damien asked. "At the restaurant?" Sebastian tilted his head slightly. "From the moment I arrived. Your man near the service entrance was adequate. The one by the bar was obvious." a faint note of something that might have been fondness. Not for Damien understood now, but for the craft of it, for the game of it. I taught you most of what you know about surveillance. Did you think I wouldn't recognize my own methods? The documentation you sent. You built it today. I built it 3 weeks ago, Sebastian said calmly. When I understood that Garrison had found the payment trail, I updated the creation timestamps. What Garrison's metadata analysis found was a deliberate signal. I wanted you to know the documentation was constructed because I wanted you coming to that meeting already angry and already suspicious. Angry and suspicious men make faster decisions than careful ones. He paused. You came to the restaurant to confront me. You weren't there to listen. That was what I needed. Damien said nothing. The conversation gave me a timeline, Sebastian continued. You knew about the payment. You were 3 to 6 hours from knowing the rest. My operation had to move last night, or not at all. He said it without apology. Not coldly, almost conversationally, the way a chess player describes a sequence of moves after the game is finished. I want you to understand that I didn't enjoy this part. The operational components. The violence. I'm not built for it the way some people are. I'm built for the longer game. 22 years, Damien said. 22 years. Sebastian met his eyes. You were 22 years old when I found you. You had fire and you had instinct, and you had no idea how to build something that would last. I built it with you. Every piece of infrastructure, every alliance, every strategic decision that made the Ashford Syndicate what it is today. He stopped, corrected himself. What it was. I built that. And now you want it back. I want what was always going to be mine. The composure didn't crack. It simply revealed itself to be something other than what it had appeared. Not warmth, not mentorship, but the long patience of ownership waiting to be exercised. I was never your advisor, Damien. I was your architect. There's a difference. Architects don't work for the building. The room was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you just kill me? Damien asked. 8 attempts. All of them failed. At some point you had to know Vivian was intercepting them. Why not try a 9th, a 10th? Something shifted in Sebastian's face. Subtle, but real. Because killing you creates succession problems, he said. Contested inheritance, rival claims, factions. I needed you to transfer authority, voluntarily, or under conditions that made resistance impossible. A living Damien Ashford, who publicly steps down, is worth more to me than a dead one. He paused again, and in the pause was something that Damien couldn't quite read. And because she made it very difficult, Vivian. Your wife. Sebastian said the word without inflection. Former wife, as of 48 hours ago, your very own walking catastrophe. For the first time, the composure shifted into something with an edge to it. Not anger, something more careful than anger. Something that looked like professional respect expressing itself through clenched teeth. I spent 6 years trying to understand how she kept finding my contractors. 6 years. The woman has no public profile, no visible network, no official standing in any organization I could map. And every single time I sent someone near you, she found them, neutralized them, cleaned the evidence, and went back to being your invisible wife at the dinner table. You were afraid of her, Damien said. I was careful of her, Sebastian said. There's a difference. There isn't. Damien looked at him steadily. You spent 6 years trying to get rid of her, and every time she beat you, so you changed the approach. You got me to get rid of her instead. The silence that followed had a different texture than the previous ones. Smart, Sebastian said finally, quietly. That's the thing about you, Damien. You always were smart, just not quite fast enough. He stood up. I need you to sign some documents. Transfer of authority. Clean, legal, witnessed. The syndicate's operational assets, the network access, the infrastructure agreements, all of it, tonight. And if I don't? Sebastian looked at him with something that might, in another context, have been sadness. Marcus is in the next room, he said. 11 years of loyalty is a real thing. I don't dismiss that. I'm not going to insult you by pretending the people I have in this building could make Marcus Trent do something he didn't want to do without significant cost to everyone involved. He moved to the table against the wall, picked up a folder and set it in front of Damien. But there are 47 people connected to your organization whose current physical locations I have documented. Soldiers, administrators, 2 people who cook at the estate and have families in the city. 47 people who have nothing to do with the disagreement between us and everything to do with leverage. Damien looked at the folder. Sign the documents, Sebastian said, and everyone goes home. Damien opened the folder. He read the first page, then the second. He read slowly and carefully, the way Sebastian had taught him to read legal documents 20 years ago. Never skim, never trust a summary, always find the clause that isn't mentioned in the conversation. He found it on page 7. A secondary transfer provision, buried in the operational language of the 4th subsection. It transferred not just the Ashford Syndicate's assets, but all affiliated networks, including any networks held under spousal or familial agreements entered during the period of the marriage. The Sterling Consortium access, the corridors Vivian had brought into the marriage, the infrastructure she'd allowed to interlock with his operation over 7 years, the channels and pipelines and relationships that Garrison had described as operating across 11 national economies. Sebastian didn't just want the Ashford Syndicate. He'd never just wanted the Ashford Syndicate. He wanted what Vivian had, and he was trying to reach it through Damien because he couldn't reach it directly, because Vivian had already demonstrated 6 times over 5 years that she could not be reached directly. This clause, Damien said, setting his finger on page 7. You know I can't transfer what isn't mine to transfer. The marital asset provisions under the agreements your attorney filed are superseded by the Sterling Consortium's own internal governance structure, which operates independently of any marital arrangement and reverts all access rights to the primary holder upon dissolution of the marriage. Damien looked up. You know this. You researched it. You've had 6 years to research it. Sebastian's expression didn't change, but he didn't argue the point, which confirmed it. So this document, Damien said, is a mechanism to create the appearance of a legitimate transfer, something you can wave at the Sterling Consortium's partners as evidence of authorized succession. You're hoping they won't examine it closely enough in the first 72 hours to identify the structural problem. 72 hours is enough time to establish facts on the ground, Sebastian said. By the time the structural problem is identified, the operational relationships will have been redirected and the access points will be in different hands. It won't work. It will work well enough. Sebastian came back to the table and stood over the folder. Sign the documents, Damien. If I sign them, she'll know within hours. Yes. And then what? You're counting on the chaos of the transition to... I'm counting on 47 people going home to their families, Sebastian said quietly. That's what I'm asking you to focus on right now. The room had been quiet this whole time. Now Damien became aware of sounds from other parts of the building. Movement, voices at a low register, the muffled evidence of an operation that was significantly larger than the room he was sitting in. Sebastian hadn't come here with 12 men. The facility was staffed. This had been built over time, quietly, with the same patient architecture that had been building toward this moment for 22 years. Damien picked up the pen. He held it over the first signature line, and then every light in the building went out simultaneously. Not a flicker, not a failure. A cut, precise, total, the kind that doesn't happen by accident. In the first second of darkness, Damien heard Sebastian move, chair scraping, footsteps already heading somewhere specific, which meant Sebastian had practiced what to do in this exact situation, which meant Sebastian had anticipated this exact situation, which meant he had not anticipated it as a rescue. He'd anticipated it as an attack. From somewhere in the building, the east side, the loading dock, a sound that Damien recognized from the files Garrison had shown him. The pneumatic signature of suppressed weapons operating in coordinated sequence. Not the sound of a breach going wrong. The sound of a breach going exactly right, exactly fast, exactly the way people who had practiced it 1,000 times would execute it. Emergency lighting came on. Not the building's own emergency lighting. External, portable, flooded in from positions outside the high windows, white and clinical and indifferent to cover. From 3 directions simultaneously, people came through the walls, not through the doors. Through the walls, pre-weakened entry points, Damien realized, charges placed in advance, which required access to the building before tonight, which required intelligence on the building's interior layout, which required... He stopped trying to catalog it. One of the entry teams swept past him with the absolute tunnel focus of people who had a specific objective and had already discounted him as a threat. They were wearing matte black with no identifying marks. Their movements were the movements of people who had long ago internalized efficiency to the point where it looked effortless, which was the most frightening kind of competent. Sebastian's men were shouting. Some were returning fire. Some were already down. Not from gunshots, Damien registered, but from something faster than that, a targeted interference that had preceded the breach and taken communications offline and possibly other systems. From the far end of the facility, through the chaos, Damien heard a door. Not a breach. A door, opening deliberately, from outside. Footsteps. Single set. Unhurried. Vivian Sterling walked into the building. She was wearing dark clothing. Practical. Nothing theatrical about it. Her hair was pulled back. She was not armed, or if she was, she wasn't displaying it. She walked through the operational chaos of her people moving in coordinated patterns around her with the same quality she'd had in the boardroom 2 days ago. The complete absence of hurry, the absolute composure of someone who had already run every version of this scenario and knew how it resolved. She looked around the room. Her people had Sebastian's men contained in under 4 minutes. Damien counted. He couldn't help counting, because counting was the only thing his brain could find to do that wasn't simply staring at the woman he'd dismissed and divorced, and who had apparently just dismantled a 22-year conspiracy on a 48-hour timeline while he was being driven around in a car that smelled wrong. She found Sebastian. 2 of her operatives had him near the wall, not restrained, not physically, but positioned in a way that made the point. Sebastian was looking at her with an expression that Damien had never seen on him before either. The composure was still there, but it had cracks in it now, hairline fractures running through the surface, and what was visible underneath wasn't the focused calm of a strategist in control of his situation. It was the face of a man who had been absolutely certain he had accounted for every variable. "Vivian," Sebastian said. His voice was level. He was working to keep it level. "You moved faster than I projected." "I moved exactly as fast as the situation required," she said. "How did you find this facility?" "You used a logistics coordinator named Paul Dreyer for the fit-out. Dreyer did work for the consortium 4 years ago. We retained a relationship." She looked at him without hostility. That was the thing Damien couldn't reconcile. There was no anger in her face, no triumph, just the flat assessment of someone evaluating a result against a projected outcome. "Paul is fine. It's fine," he cooperated voluntarily. Sebastian absorbed that. "The documents," he said. Damien hadn't signed them yet. "I know." She didn't look at Damien when she said it. "The documents were never the point, Sebastian. You know the structural provision wouldn't have survived contact with the consortium's governance board. You built those documents to buy 72 hours of apparent legitimacy." A pause. "What were you actually trying to do in 72 hours? For the first time, Sebastian said nothing. The silence lasted long enough to mean something. Vivian turned to one of her operatives. "The server room in the northeast corner. Pull everything. Physical drives, not copies." The operative moved. Sebastian's jaw tightened. The first involuntary physical reaction Damien had seen from him all night. "There it is," Vivian said quietly. She looked at Sebastian for a long moment, and then she did something Damien didn't expect. She pulled a chair from against the wall, set it in front of Sebastian, and sat down in it. Not above him, level with him, as if this was a conversation rather than a capture. "You've been building toward this for 22 years, she said. Her voice wasn't hard. It was almost, not gentle, but measured in a way that felt deliberate, like she was choosing each word for maximum precision rather than maximum impact. You had everything mapped, every contingency. You even mapped me, as well as you could." She studied his face. "What did you think was in those servers that I hadn't already found?" Sebastian looked at her steadily. "Tell me," she said. "You've been in a Royces company, always with Damien between us. You spent 6 years trying to understand how I found your contractors, and you never could. I'd like to know what conclusions you reached." "That you had an asset inside my operation," Sebastian said. "Someone I trusted." "Who?" He named a man. Someone 3 layers deep in Sebastian's organization. A mid-level coordinator whom Sebastian had trusted for 8 years. Vivian's expression didn't confirm or deny it. "I'm going to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to think about it carefully rather than answer from instinct. What would it mean for your larger objective if you gave me the access codes to those servers voluntarily?" Sebastian stared at her. It would mean, he said slowly, that whatever was on them wouldn't be used to activate your secondary containment sequence. Correct. There's a secondary containment sequence. There has been for 3 years. She met his gaze. The servers have files that connect 12 of your current operational allies to activities they would very much prefer stayed private. You were planning to use those files as leverage to consolidate your position in the 72 hours after the document transfer. She paused. If I activate the containment sequence, those files go to people who will act on them immediately. Your 12 allies become 12 active enemies overnight. Sebastian looked at her. The access codes, he said, protect me from nothing if you already have the containment sequence set up. Correct, Vivian said. So the question isn't about protection. The question is whether you want those 12 people to spend the next 10 years trying to find you, or whether you want to have a conversation with me about what happens now. Damien was standing 8 feet away from this exchange, and he had the acute and disorienting experience of watching it the way you watch something happen through glass, present, visible, completely separated from the actual mechanics of what was occurring. Sebastian Crowe, who had outmaneuvered every person he had ever sat across from for 40 years, looked at Vivian Sterling and understood that he was not going to outmaneuver her. Whatever he saw in her face, or didn't see, whatever absence was there, he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small card with a handwritten 16-digit sequence and held it out. She took it. She didn't thank him. She simply handed it to the operative who appeared at her shoulder with the timing of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. Sebastian Crowe is to be secured in the East Room, Vivian said. Comfortable, fed, unharmed. He'll be needed for a conversation in approximately 6 hours. 2 operatives moved to escort him. Sebastian stood. He adjusted his jacket with the automatic dignity of a man who had held his composure through the entire night and was going to hold it through this too. He looked at Damien as he passed. For a moment, just a moment, the cracks in the composure opened wide enough to see what was underneath. Not remorse, nothing as clean as remorse, but something complicated and exhausted and very old. I did build it, Sebastian said. Everything. That part was true. Then he walked through the door. Damien stood in the white light of the portable floods, in the gradually quieting facility, surrounded by Vivian's operatives moving with professional efficiency through the space, and looked at his ex-wife. She was looking at him. For the first time since the boardroom, she was looking directly at him, and the thing in her expression was not anger, and it was not satisfaction, and it was not the composure she'd shown for everything else tonight. It was something that looked like the aftermath of grief. Not fresh grief. Old grief. The kind that had been carried so long it had become structural. You didn't feel it as pain anymore. You just knew it was part of the load. You signed those papers, she said. I know. You didn't ask me one question in 7 years. The words were not an accusation. They were a fact, delivered with the same flat precision as everything else she said. But flat precision from Vivian, Damien was beginning to understand, was not the absence of feeling. It was feeling compressed until it was dense enough to go through walls. I know, he said again. It was insufficient. He was aware it was insufficient. Her phone vibrated. She looked at it. Something in her posture shifted, not visibly to anyone who wasn't watching closely, but Damien was watching closely now in a way he had failed to watch for 7 years. There's a situation developing at the Northeast Port, she said. She was already moving. Vivian, she stopped without turning around. I promised to protect my husband, she said, 7 years ago. I made that decision and I honored it, and I would honor it again because that's the kind of person I am, not because you deserved it. A pause. But I need you to understand something clearly. The only reason Sebastian Crowe didn't succeed tonight is because I've been building a case against him for 3 years, waiting for him to show his hand completely. And the only reason he showed it tonight, the only reason he moved at all, was because you did exactly what he needed you to do. She turned to look at him then, just briefly. He used your pride, she said. He knew he could. He'd been studying it for 22 years. Another pause. That has to change, starting now, because what comes next is not going to accommodate a man who can be aimed by his own ego. Then she walked through the door into the dark outside, and her operatives flowed after her, and Damien was left standing in a building that had just been taken apart and reassembled around him, holding nothing, No phone, no allies he could confirm, no authority that hadn't just been demonstrated to rest on a foundation somebody else had built. Marcus appeared from a side room. He had a cut above his left eyebrow that he was pressing with the back of his hand, and his expression was the expression of a man who had spent 11 years as the most capable person in every room and had just spent 4 minutes in a room that reclassified him. "You all right?" Marcus asked. "No," Damien said. "What do we do?" Damien looked at the door through which Vivian had disappeared. "We follow her," he said, "and we stop pretending we know more than we do." Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once and picked up a radio from the table and said into it, "This is Trent. All remaining Ashford personnel, stand down your current positions and await instruction." Outside, somewhere in the city, the Northeast Port was developing a situation. And for the first time in 48 hours, for possibly the first time in 7 years, Damien Ashford walked towards something without believing he already knew what it was. The Northeast Port at 3 in the morning was a different city. Not the city that appeared in financial projections or trade agreements or the carefully managed public record of a functioning commercial hub. The port at 3 in the morning was cranes standing dark against a sky that glowed orange-gray with ambient light, and the smell of diesel and salt water, and something chemical underneath that nobody officially acknowledged, and the specific silence of a place where large things moved slowly in the dark, and the men who moved them had learned not to ask questions. Damien knew this port. He had run 2 warehouses here for 6 years. He knew which security cameras had blind spots and which dock supervisors took payments to look the wrong direction at the right moment. He had considered it, in a distant professional way, his territory. The black SUV carrying him and Marcus pulled in behind Vivian's convoy at the secondary access point, a gate off the Eastern Service Road that didn't appear on the port's official layout. Vivian's lead vehicle was already stopped. 2 of her operatives were at the gate talking to someone inside, and the conversation was short, and the gate opened. "What's the situation?" Marcus asked through the window as they passed. The operative who answered didn't look at Marcus. She was looking at a tablet in her hand with the focus of someone managing multiple incoming data streams simultaneously. 3 of Sebastian's remaining commanders moved on the port 40 minutes ago. They don't know Sebastian is contained. They're executing a pre-planned contingency. If Sebastian's primary operation failed, the contingency was to seize the port's data infrastructure. The routing servers for 6 international shipping corridors run through a facility on Dock 9. They take those servers, Damien said, and they have leverage over every operation running through this port. Over 600 operations, the operative confirmed. Cargo, financial transfers, logistics chains across 4 continents. The disruption alone would cost... She stopped, looked at her tablet. "They're ahead of us. They've already breached the Dock 9 perimeter." "How many?" "We're estimating 30. Armed, professional, operating on a tight timeline. They know exactly where they're going." She looked up for the first time. At Damien. They were briefed on the facility layout by someone with detailed internal knowledge. Sebastian. The access codes he'd used for the facility tonight hadn't just covered the servers. They'd covered the operational intelligence Sebastian had been building for years, including layout documentation for every strategic infrastructure point in the city. Documentation Sebastian had gathered during 22 years of sitting across from Damien at planning tables. "Where's Vivian?" Damien asked. "Already moving toward Dock 9. The operative was already turning away. "Mr. Ashford, she said to tell you that you're welcome to observe from the secondary perimeter." She said to use those exact words. Marcus made a sound beside him that wasn't quite a laugh. Observe from the secondary perimeter, the phrasing of someone who didn't want him in the way. "Tell her I'm coming in," Damien said. "Sir, tell her." Dock 9 was a concrete facility that had been built in the 1970s and retrofitted 4 times since, each retrofit adding infrastructure without removing anything, producing the architectural chaos of a building that had been solved and resolved without ever being truly rebuilt. Pipes ran across ceilings that were themselves hung below older ceilings. Corridors split and doubled back. The routing server room was in the building's original core, concrete walls 18 inches thick, a single primary entrance, 2 emergency exits that required biometric clearance to open from either direction. They came in through the loading dock. Damien stayed close to Marcus and tried to do the thing Vivian had said, stop pretending he knew more than he did. What that meant in practice was moving when Marcus moved, stopping when Marcus stopped, and not making decisions based on his read of a situation that other people in this operation had spent considerably more time preparing for. It was, he discovered, extremely difficult. The first contact happened in the service corridor outside the main server room. One of Sebastian's men came around a corner moving fast and ran into the lead operative of Vivian's team at a range that made weapons irrelevant, and what followed was 4 seconds of brutal, close-quarters practical violence that left Sebastian's man on the floor and the operative checking a split in her lower lip with 2 fingers before moving on without breaking stride. Marcus pulled Damien against the wall as 2 more came from the left. They'd heard the contact, were already repositioned, were moving on a flanking path that would have caught Vivian's people from behind if Marcus hadn't seen it coming. "Left corridor," Marcus said quietly into his radio. "2, moving to flank. 60 seconds. A response crackled back. The flankers were intercepted before they reached the turn. Damien's heart was doing something that wasn't fear exactly. It was past fear. It was the compressed electrical state that lives on the other side of fear when the situation is too immediate to leave room for it. He was aware of his own breathing, aware of the weight of the secondary weapon Marcus had retrieved for him from the SUV, which he was holding with the practiced grip of a man who had grown up in environments where such things were necessary, but who had spent the last several years letting other people manage the operational end. He was also aware, moving through the service corridor with plaster dust on his jacket and his pulse in his ears, that he had not been in a situation this direct and this unmanaged since he was 22 years old and Sebastian had found him. Sebastian, who had taken that 22-year-old with fire and instinct and no infrastructure and had spent 2 decades patiently building a cage around him while calling it an empire. The anger arrived then, finally, the actual anger. Not the wounded pride of a man who'd been outsmarted, but something colder and more fundamental, the anger of someone who had been loved by a teacher and discovered the love was a tool. That particular anger didn't make you reckless. It made you very, very still. He held it. The server room door came into view at the end of the corridor. It was open, which meant Sebastian's people were already inside. Vivian was standing 10 feet from the server room door with 2 of her operatives, and she was doing something that Damien didn't immediately understand. She was waiting, not hesitating, waiting with the deliberate patience of someone who was allowing a situation to develop to a specific point before intervening. She registered Damien's arrival with a look that was neither surprised nor welcoming. She'd been told he was coming. She'd chosen not to stop him. Those were 2 different things. "They're transmitting," she said quietly. Not to Damien, to the operative on her left. 40% complete, the operative responded, reading from a tablet. Estimated 6 minutes to full extraction. Let it run to 60. You want them to extract 60% of... 60%, Vivian said. The operative stopped asking. Damien looked at her. "What's at 60%? She glanced at him, measured something, decided. "The routing data they're extracting is partitioned. The first 60% is operational, shipping manifests, logistics chains, financial routing, genuinely valuable, enough that they'll believe the extraction is succeeding." She paused. "The last 40% is something else, something I put there 3 weeks ago when I understood what Sebastian was building toward. When they extract it and try to use it, it will broadcast the identities, locations, and operational records of every one of Sebastian's remaining allied commanders to 7 law enforcement agencies across 4 jurisdictions simultaneously." Damien stared at her. "You seeded their target," he said. "I had access to this facility's infrastructure through a logistics relationship. I used it." She was watching the door. "The extraction needs to reach 60% to ensure the trigger data is included in what they take. If we stop them before 60, they take genuinely valuable data and get away clean. If we let them reach 60, you burn Sebastian's entire remaining network." "What's left of it?" she said. "Yes." From inside the server room, muffled through concrete, Damien could hear voices. Terse, professional, the voices of people managing a technical operation under time pressure. He counted at least 4, probably 6. There would be more posted at entry points. 30 men total, the operative had said, most of them distributed through the building to hold perimeter. 68%, the operative said. Something changed in Vivian's posture, almost imperceptible. "Move," she said. They went through the door. What followed was not the choreographed efficiency of the facility breach an hour ago. That had been prepared and rehearsed. This was improvised inside a room full of server racks and running men and the sharp electric smell of overloaded equipment. And it was loud, and it was wrong in the specific way that close-quarters situations are always wrong, where the plan lasts approximately 4 seconds, and then everyone is operating on instinct and reflex and the accumulated damage of everything that happened in the previous 48 hours. Damien moved right without thinking, tracking a man who was going for a secondary exit, and the man turned and they were close enough that neither of them could effectively use the weapons they were holding. What happened was ugly and efficient and left Damien with a pain in his left forearm that he classified as minor and moved past. The man did not get up. Marcus was in the center of the room doing what Marcus did, which was manage space and angles with the quiet competence of someone who had spent 11 years ensuring that the people around him stayed alive. He was moving fast and speaking fast into his radio, coordinating Vivian's people and his own simultaneously, the strange joint operation of two organizations that had never worked together, finding the grammar of it in real time through necessity. From the far end of the server room, a voice. "Stop!" One of Sebastian's commanders, the man Damien recognized as Rael Corton, who had run Sebastian's Western logistics operations for a decade. Corton was holding a phone, not a weapon, a phone with an active call, and he was holding it up so the room could see it. Everyone in the room stopped. "I have a direct line to the building's fire suppression system," Corton said. His voice was controlled, but there was sweat on his face, and his eyes were moving fast across the room, counting, calculating the math, and finding it as unfavorable as Sebastian's man had found it 3 hours ago. Halon suppression. This room, all server racks, everything. 40 seconds of flooding, and every server in this facility is non-recoverable. The tablet operative made a sound. Vivian's hand came up, and the room stayed still. "You do that," Vivian said, "and the data your people just extracted is the only copy, which makes it extremely valuable." She looked at Corton steadily. "Is that what Sebastian instructed you to do if the extraction was compromised?" Corton said nothing, which was an answer. "Rael," Damien said. Corton looked at him. The look of a man who had served Sebastian's interests for years while appearing to exist in the peripheral orbit of the Ashford Syndicate, and who was now standing in a server room in the middle of the night, holding a phone and watching the entire architecture of his professional life develop structural failures in real time. "Sebastian is in custody," Damien said. "His primary operation failed 3 hours ago. Whatever contingency plan he gave you, whatever he told you would happen if you got the data out, he's not in a position to execute it." "You're telling me to trust you," Corton said. "You, specifically." "I'm telling you what's true. Sebastian told me things that were true for 20 years and they were in service of an objective he never disclosed." Corton's jaw was tight. Why would I make the same mistake twice in one night? It was a fair point. It landed without any obvious response for 2 full seconds. And in those 2 seconds, Damien felt the particular specific helplessness of a man whose credibility had been comprehensively spent, who was standing in a room asking someone to trust him and understanding perfectly well why that someone wouldn't. Vivian stepped forward. She walked across the server room floor toward Corton with a directness that made 2 of his remaining men physically move to intercept and then stop when she didn't slow down, recalculating, uncertain, because she was moving without the posture of a threat, without aggression, and it disrupted the algorithm of men who were prepared for opposition, but not for this. She stopped in front of Corton. "You have a daughter," she said, 8 years old. She attends the Meridian Academy, and she's been struggling with mathematics, and you've been working with her on it on Sunday afternoons for the past 3 months. Corton stared at her. "I'm not telling you that as a threat," Vivian said. Her voice was even and clear. "I'm telling you because I want you to understand that I've known who you are for a long time. I've known who your people are. I've known where they live and what they care about." She met his eyes. "And in 6 years of monitoring Sebastian's operation, with 6 years of opportunities to use that information, I never have, because that's not what this is." The room was absolutely silent. "What Sebastian wanted," she continued, "would have required dismantling things that took generations to build, destroying relationships that protect people who have nothing to do with the choices made in rooms like this one. I've spent 6 years trying to stop that from happening without burning everything down in the process." She paused. Put the phone down, Rail, not because you trust me, because you're a man who works with information for a living. And the information in front of you says the play you're holding doesn't win. Corton's hand was very still. The phone hand. The one that was connected, presumably, to a suppression system that would make the last 4 hours completely irrelevant. 7 seconds passed. He ended the call. He set the phone on top of the nearest server rack. He looked at Damien, not at Vivian, at Damien, with an expression that had too many things in it to read cleanly. For what it's worth, Corton said, I didn't know about the 8 attempts. I found out tonight, going through Sebastian's contingency files to prep the operation. He paused. I would not have been part of that. I want that noted. It's noted, Damien said. The aftermath of a collapsed operation has a specific texture. Damien had seen it before from the winning side. The sudden drop in pressure, the way the air in a space changes when the outcome is no longer contested, how exhaustion arrives all at once in people who have been running on cortisol and find the cortisol withdrawing simultaneously. Men sitting against walls. The mechanical process of securing and accounting, voices dropping to normal volume for the first time in hours. He found a section of wall that wasn't occupied and put his back against it and let his legs carry the weight they'd been carrying for 3 days. His left forearm was telling him something more insistent than minor. He looked at it. The sleeve was dark. He'd known somewhere in the operational part of his brain that there was more damage there than a bruise, and he'd filed it under later, and later appeared to be now. Marcus materialized beside him with the situational awareness that had made him indispensable for 11 years. That needs attention, Marcus said, nodding at the arm. I know. There's a medical kit in the lead vehicle. In a minute. Marcus looked at him, at the arm, at his face, then out at the room, at Vivian's operatives processing the situation with efficient professionalism, at Corton sitting with 2 of them in what appeared to be a voluntary conversation rather than a detainment. She knew about the seeded data, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. 3 weeks ago. Marcus was quiet for a moment. She knew 3 weeks ago what Sebastian was planning to do with this port, and she stayed. In the house. With you. While you... He stopped himself. While I was being managed into signing divorce papers by the person who had spent 20 years planning to take everything I built, Damien said. Yes. Why didn't she tell you? Damien looked at him. Because I wouldn't have believed her, he said. You know I wouldn't have believed her. If Vivian had come to me 3 weeks ago and said Sebastian Crowe has been running a 22-year play to take this organization and he's using your pride as the mechanism, you know exactly what I would have said. Marcus was quiet. I would have said she was jealous of my relationship with him, Damien said. I would have said she didn't understand the history. I would have said she was looking for a reason to undermine someone she'd never been comfortable with. And I would have said it with complete confidence and zero self-examination. He paused. She knew that. She's always known that. And she made a calculation that the cost of telling me was higher than the cost of waiting. The cost of waiting was the divorce. Yes. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. That's a hard calculation to make about someone you... He stopped again, chose words. Someone who matters to you. Yes, Damien said again. It is. Across the server room, Vivian was standing with her senior operative, reviewing something on the tablet. Even now, past 3 in the morning, at the end of 48 hours that had dismantled and reassembled the entire structure of everything Damien had thought he knew. Her posture was straight, and her focus was complete, and she looked like someone at the beginning of a workday rather than the ragged end of a crisis. But Damien was watching differently now. Watching the way you watch something when you stop looking at the surface and start trying to see what's underneath. Her right hand, at her side, was making a small repetitive movement. Just the thumb, running across the first 2 fingers. Back and forth. Something she did, he realized, when she was thinking hard about something she hadn't yet resolved. He'd seen it hundreds of times in 7 years and registered it as a neutral habit, like the way some people tap a pen. He understood now it was what contained everything that didn't make it to her face. She was worried about something beyond the current situation, something the current situation had moved or revealed or failed to close. He pushed off the wall and walked toward her. She registered his approach without looking up from the tablet. You need medical attention, she said. What are you worried about? She looked up then. The small movement of her thumb stopped. What makes you think I'm worried? Your hand, he said. You do that when something isn't resolved. The silence that followed was different from the silences they'd had in the boardroom, in the car, in the facility. It had a different quality, the quality of something that had just shifted slightly in its foundations. Sebastian's files, she said finally. The server's here. The contingency materials Corton was working from. She looked back at the tablet. There's a reference to a meeting, 14 days ago. 11 participants, none of them identified by real name. The agenda descriptor is, it's not specific, but the infrastructure being discussed in the preparatory materials isn't the Ashford Syndicate. She paused. It's the Sterling Consortium. Damien's arm was throbbing. I wasn't coming after me, Damien said slowly. He was coming after you first. You were the accelerant. The public divorce, the destabilization, the document transfer. All of that would have created a disruption in the consortium's operational access that gave a window. She looked at him. Sebastian has been patient for 22 years. He's been patient because the consortium was always the actual target, and the consortium is significantly harder to take by force or by leverage. He needed a crisis, a genuine extended crisis in the consortium's most significant external relationship, something that would pull focus inward and create the kind of institutional moment where an outside actor with the right access could... Her phone rang. She looked at it. Her face did something it hadn't done all night. This is one of my senior directors, she said. Her voice was still controlled. He only calls at this hour if... She answered. Damien watched her face. She listened for 40 seconds without speaking. In those 40 seconds, the hand at her side resumed its movement, faster now, more compressed, the thumb moving with the urgent rhythm of a mind processing a cascade of implications faster than the rest of the body could catch up. Tell them nothing moves until I'm there, she said. Nothing. Anyone who acts without my direct authorization is out. She ended the call. She looked at Damien, and Damien saw, for the first time in 7 years, something in Vivian Sterling's face that wasn't composure, wasn't calculation, wasn't the managed surface of someone who had decided long ago to carry everything alone. It was fear. Clean, specific, and absolutely controlled, but fear. The meeting Sebastian referenced, she said, 14 days ago. 11 participants. What about it? It wasn't Sebastian's meeting, she said. He was a participant. Someone else called it. Who? She held his gaze. My father's former second-in-command, she said. A man named Elliot Vane. A man I was told died 7 years ago. She paused, and the pause was the length of someone absorbing a truth that changes the shape of everything around it. A man who apparently did not die, and who has been using Sebastian as a mechanism, the same way Sebastian was using you, to create a crisis large enough to fracture the consortium's governance structure from within. The server room around them continued its aftermath. Operatives moved. Equipment was processed. Corton sat against a wall having a quiet conversation with 2 of Vivian's people. Marcus stood 10 feet away watching Damien with the vigilant attention of 11 years. The arm, the 48 hours, the divorce papers in the boardroom and the 12 Royces and the facility breach, and this room, and every step of the last 2 days that Damien had spent trying to understand who Vivian was, who Sebastian was, what had been built, and what had been dismantled. All of it had been the opening move. Not Sebastian's opening move. Elliot Vane's. He's going to move on the consortium tonight, Vivian said. Her voice had come back to its controlled center. While I'm here, while our attention is here. This was the diversion, Damien, Sebastian, the port, all of it. We closed the wrong operation. She was already moving toward the door. Vivian. He said it without thinking, with more directness than he'd managed in 7 years of marriage. She stopped. Tell me what you need, he said. She turned and looked at him across the server room floor, in the harsh white light of 3 in the morning, and for one moment the composure and the strategy and the 7 years of carrying everything alone were entirely absent from her face, and what was there instead was something raw and exhausted and unguarded. I need, she said carefully, someone who is going to stop making decisions based on what he thinks he already knows. He met her eyes. Then I'm with you, he said. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she turned and walked through the door, and Damien Ashford, with a damaged arm and 48 hours of wreckage behind him, and the first genuinely clear moment of vision he'd had in 22 years, followed her into whatever was coming. The Sterling Consortium's primary coordination facility was not listed on any document that existed in any accessible registry. It occupied the upper 4 floors of a building in the financial district that officially housed an architectural consultancy on its lower levels. A real business, legitimately operated, staffed by people who designed real buildings and had no idea what ran through the secure infrastructure above their drafting tables. The building's upper floors had their own independent power supply, their own ventilation system, their own communications array that didn't touch the building's commercial network at any point. It had been built this way by Vivian's father 30 years ago, and in 30 years it had never been breached. They covered the 12 minutes from the port in 4 vehicles, running hard through streets that were empty, in the particular way that pre-dawn streets are empty. Not abandoned, just thin, with the occasional truck or taxi moving through gaps in the silence. Vivian was in the lead vehicle on the phone for the entire 12 minutes, talking in a voice too low for Damien to hear from the seat behind her, her free hand flat on her knee with the enforced stillness of someone managing the urge to move. Marcus had gotten a field dressing on Damien's arm from the kit in the SUV. Not good work. Functional, temporary, the kind that stops the bleeding and defers everything else. The arm had settled from acute pain into a dull, insistent pressure that Damien had learned in earlier years to partition and ignore. He partitioned it and ignored it and tried to listen to what he could gather from Vivian's half of the calls. What he gathered was not reassuring. Elliot Vane had moved on the consortium's facility 40 minutes ago. Not with a breach, nothing so direct. He had used the governance fracture that Sebastian's extended operation had been designed to create. 3 of the consortium's 7 senior directors had received falsified documentation in the past 72 hours. Documentation suggesting that Vivian had been operating outside the consortium's charter, making unilateral decisions, exposing the organization to external risk without authorization. Fabricated records, detailed enough and timed precisely enough against the chaos of the divorce and the public dissolution of Vivian's position to land on exhausted people in a destabilized organization at exactly the moment when doubt was most available. 2 of the 3 directors had suspended their network access pending review. Standard protocol when governance questions arose. Completely reasonable. And completely effective at pulling 2/7 of the consortium's senior authorization capacity offline at the moment Vane needed it most. The 3rd director had done something more serious. He had convened an emergency session. Hargrove, Vivian said, ending a call and turning slightly in her seat. She wasn't speaking to Damien specifically, more processing aloud, which was itself a shift from the woman who had carried everything internally for 7 years. Leonard Hargrove. He's been with the consortium for 19 years. My father trusted him completely. I've trusted him. She paused. He called the emergency session using his legitimate authority. He genuinely believes the documentation he received. Vane knew which director to target, Damien said. Vane helped my father build the governance structure. He knows every pressure point in it. Her voice was controlled, but there was something abraded in it. The sound of someone speaking through something that wanted to be anger, but was being held at a more useful temperature. Leonard isn't a traitor. He's a man who received convincing false information and did exactly what the protocols told him to do. That's worse than a traitor in some ways because you can't be angry at him for it. What does the emergency session authorize? She turned fully in her seat then and looked at him directly. A temporary transfer of operational authority, she said, to a governing committee rather than a single director. Standard crisis governance measure, designed to prevent any one person from having sole authority during a period of contested leadership. She held his gaze. If Vane has placed his people on that committee, which he will have, because calling that session was the objective of the past 6 years, then the transfer gives him legitimate governance authority over the consortium's operational infrastructure. Not stolen, not seized, voted in by a body operating under the consortium's own charter. And there's no mechanism to challenge it once it's done. There is one, she said. The founding director's emergency override. It requires physical presence and biometric confirmation at the facility's primary authorization terminal. She paused again. My father built it as a last resort. It supersedes committee authority and restores direct governance pending a full director review. Can you use it? I'm the inheriting director, she said. Yes. Then what's the problem? The vehicle turned onto the approach street for the building, and Vivian looked forward through the windshield. The problem, she said, is that the emergency session convenes in 11 minutes, and Vane knows about the override. He's had 30 years to know about it. She stopped. He'll have people at the terminal. The building's lobby was not controlled by Vane's people. That was the first thing Damien assessed when they came through the service entrance. The lobby team was consortium staff, recognized Vivian immediately, and the relief on their faces was the unguarded relief of people who had been managing a confusing and frightening situation and had just seen the person they were waiting for walk through the door. The elevators to the upper floors required Vivian's biometric confirmation. She provided it without slowing down, and the doors opened and they went up. 4 of Vivian's operatives: Marcus, Damien, and Vivian, who was reviewing something on her phone with the compressed focus of someone consuming critical information in the 30 seconds before it needed to be acted on. The elevator opened on the 31st floor. 3 men were in the corridor, not consortium staff. The body language was wrong, too positioned, too alert, carrying themselves with the particular surface tension readiness of people who were expecting contact. They were wearing civilian clothing well enough to pass a casual look, but Damien had spent 22 years reading rooms, and these men were not what they were dressed as. Vivian's operatives moved before Damien had fully finished the thought. The corridor was not large. What happened in it was fast and painful and ended with 3 men on the floor and one of Vivian's operatives pressing a hand to a cut on his jaw, and the whole exchange had lasted less than 40 seconds and generated noise that had definitely been heard by whoever was beyond the door at the end of the hall. "Move," Vivian said. They moved. The primary authorization terminal occupied an anteroom adjacent to the consortium's main governance chamber, a space that felt, despite everything, like it had been designed by someone who understood that the decisions made inside it would carry weight and had wanted the architecture to acknowledge that. Dark wood, clean lines, a stillness that didn't come from soundproofing alone, but from 30 years of serious people doing serious things in the presence of genuine stakes. Elliot Vane was standing beside the terminal. He was older than the photographs in Sebastian's files. The photographs had been from 7 years ago, the age at which Vivian had been told he'd died, and time had continued past that point in ways the photographs didn't capture. He was 70, or close to it, with the lean economy of a man who had never carried unnecessary weight in any dimension. His hair was white, and his eyes were the eyes of someone who had spent decades operating in the space between visible authority and actual power, and who had become so accustomed to that space that it was simply how he understood the world to be organized. Beside him stood 2 men, and beside those 2 men, Leonard Hargrove, 63, visibly exhausted, wearing the expression of someone who had been managing a governance crisis for 4 hours and was now looking at the person the crisis was ostensibly about and recalibrating rapidly. "Vivian," Vane said. His voice was the voice of someone who had known her when she was young, not warmly, not with the register of a father figure, but with the particular tone of an adult who had observed a child and made assessments about what that child would become. There was something proprietary in it, the tone of someone who had planned for this room for a long time. "Elliot," she said. Damien stayed at her left shoulder. He had stopped trying to lead anything and started trying to do the thing that Vivian had asked him to do, which was be present without the noise of ego in the way. He watched Vane, watched Hargrove, watched the 2 men beside Vane who were not consortium staff and were not going to let this room resolve without incident. "You're 43 minutes ahead of schedule," Vane said. "The port operation was supposed to hold you longer." "You built the port operation around Sebastian's timeline," Vivian said. "Sebastian's timeline was disrupted." "I see that." He looked past her at Damien, at the field dressing on the arm, the 2 days visible in Damien's face, the damaged condition of a man who had been through something. Something moved in Vane's expression. Not surprise, more like the particular shift of a chess player adjusting to a move that changed the shape of the board without changing the fundamental position. "You brought Ashford." "Yes." "I wouldn't have projected that." "No," Vivian said. "You wouldn't have." Hargrove stepped forward. "Vivian, I need to understand the documentation I received, the records showing unauthorized operations, the external exposure. Are fabricated, she said. She looked at him directly, without softness but without condemnation either. Leonard, you did what the protocols told you to do. The protocols exist for good reasons. But the documentation was built by someone who has spent 6 years studying the consortium's governance structure, specifically to find the pressure points in it. She paused. I can provide you with the provenance trail on every document you received. Every one of them was created within the past 3 weeks. I'll give you the metadata, the construction records, the intermediate files. Hargrove looked at her, then at Vane. Something crossed his face. Slow, heavy. The look of a man who has been carrying a conviction for 4 hours and is feeling it begin to give way under new weight. The emergency session, Hargrove said. He was talking to Vane now. You told me there was urgency, that waiting for Vivian to respond was operationally dangerous. Vane's attention stayed on Vivian. Leonard, the session convenes in 7 minutes. We can address questions of documentation after the governance transfer is complete. No, Hargrove said. Vane looked at him. No, Hargrove said again. His voice had found something it hadn't had a moment ago. Not volume, just solidity. The sound of a man who had trusted the wrong thing for 4 hours and was correcting his footing. I convened that session on the basis of information you provided. If that information is contested, the session does not proceed. The charter provides for... I know what the charter provides for. I wrote 3 sections of it. Hargrove turned to Vivian. Use the override. Vane moved, not toward Vivian, toward the terminal, fast, with the speed of a 70-year-old man who had stayed fast because he had known for 30 years that this room might require it. His 2 men moved simultaneously, and Marcus was already in motion, and the anteroom became a collision of bodies and intentions in a space that was too small and too significant for any of it. Damien went for the terminal, not for Vane. For the terminal, because Vivian needed to reach it, and Vane's trajectory was going to intersect hers before she got there. He put himself in the intersection and took the physical consequence of it. Vane's elbow caught him across the damaged arm, and the pain that he had been partitioning for an hour arrived all at once with the full force of something that had been waiting for permission, and he went down to one knee on the hardwood floor and held on. He held on because going down to one knee was not the same as stopping. Vivian stepped past him. She placed her hand on the terminal's biometric panel, her eyes on the screen. Her breathing. He could hear her breathing from where he was, one knee on the floor with his arm sending urgent messages his brain was declining to read, completely even. Not because she was calm, because she had decided to be. The terminal responded with a tone, a voice from the speaker, the system's own voice, designed by her father 3 decades ago. Override authorization confirmed. Primary governance authority restored to Director Sterling pending full review. Emergency session suspended. The room went still. Vane stopped. Marcus had him. Not with violence, just presence. The immovable presence of a very large man who had decided that nothing in this room was moving without his agreement. The 2 operatives had Vane's men. Hargrove was standing with his hand pressed over his mouth, looking at the terminal, looking at Vane, absorbing something that was going to take considerably longer than this moment to fully process. Vane looked at Vivian. She turned from the terminal and looked back at him. In the silence that followed, Damien got back to his feet. His arm was bad. He was aware his arm was bad. He stood up anyway and stood beside Vivian because that was where he had said he would be. Your father would be disappointed, Vane said. His voice was quiet. Not defeated. Something more complicated than defeated. The voice of a man who had held a conviction for a very long time and had just watched it fail to manifest, and who was deciding, in real time, how to carry that. My father built the override for exactly this situation, Vivian said. He wasn't naive about the people around him. He just chose to trust them anyway and build protections in case that trust was misplaced. She held Vane's gaze. He trusted you for 40 years, Elliot. He should have given me what I'd built toward. It wasn't yours to be given. You knew that. I built half of this organization, and you were compensated for it, recognized for it, given authority that reflected it. Her voice was not angry. It was the voice of someone stating a case to someone who already knew the case and had simply decided it wasn't enough. What you wanted wasn't recognition. You wanted inheritance, and that was never going to happen because this is not that kind of organization, and you understood that from the beginning. Vane said nothing. You turned Sebastian, she said, 6 years ago. You identified him as the mechanism, a man who had his own reasons to want Damien's organization and who had the access and the patience to make it happen. You gave him resources, intelligence, the operational framework to run an extended play. And in exchange, Sebastian's seizure of the Ashford Syndicate was going to create the governance crisis you needed to take the consortium. She paused. You used everyone in this story, Elliot. Sebastian used Damien. You used Sebastian. All the way down. Vane looked at her for a long moment. You're your father's daughter, he said, and this time the tone was not proprietary. It was something unguarded and old, and what was in it was beyond Damien's ability to name precisely, but it carried the specific weight of a man looking at the failure of something he had wanted for a very long time. Yes, Vivian said. I am. The hours that followed had the strange flat quality of aftermath. Vane's people were processed out of the building. Hargrove sat with two of Vivian's senior staff for 3 hours, going through the fabricated documentation piece by piece, and the look on his face as each forgery was demonstrated was the look of a man who had trusted his own judgment and was conducting an honest forensic examination of where that judgment had led him. He didn't defend himself. He asked questions. He took notes. He was, Damien thought, watching from across the room where a medic was properly addressing his arm, a better man than a lot of people would have been in the same position. Vane was secured in a room on the 29th floor. Not roughly. With a chair and water and the professional courtesy of people who dealt with serious things without adding unnecessary cruelty to them. Vivian spent 40 minutes alone with him. Damien didn't ask what was said, and she didn't offer it, and he had learned enough in the past 72 hours to understand that some things weren't his to ask for. What she told him, hours later, in the gray early light coming through the building's east windows, was only this. He genuinely believed he'd been wronged. He'd held it for 30 years, and it had become the organizing principle of his life. There's nothing to do with that, except ensure it can't be acted on again. Damien accepted that. Sebastian, in custody at Vivian's facility across the city, had spent the night in the same state of careful comfort she'd ordered, fed, unharmed, and fully aware that the operation he'd spent 22 years constructing had collapsed completely. The conversation Vivian had promised him would happen in 6 hours had been delayed by everything that followed. It happened the next morning instead, and Vivian conducted it alone. And what resulted was a formal, documented cooperation agreement that Sebastian signed with the resigned precision of a man who understood that his options had narrowed to a single corridor. He provided everything, the full architecture of what he'd built. The names, the accounts, the operational relationships, the communications records. He provided it because Vivian made him understand, without drama, that providing it was the only version of his remaining years that didn't become something considerably worse. Damien was not in the room for that conversation either. He was beginning to understand which rooms were his and which weren't, and to find in that understanding something that was not diminishment, but its opposite. The particular relief of a man who has been trying to fill every room he entered and has discovered that presence without occupation is its own form of strength. 3 days after the port, Damien sat across a table from Hargrove in the consortium's main governance chamber. Marcus was beside him. Not for security, because Marcus had spent 11 years earning a seat at tables where decisions were made, and Damien was done making decisions that didn't include the people who had actually been keeping him alive. The conversation lasted 4 hours. What came out of it was not an agreement exactly. It was more like the beginning of one, the framework of something that would require months to build properly. The Ashford Syndicate's operational infrastructure mapped against the consortium's existing network. The corridors that had been the original strategic rationale for Vivian's marriage, now being formally integrated rather than maintained through the informal proximity of a household arrangement. Accountabilities. Governance structures. The work of making something legitimate out of things that had operated in the space between legitimate and not for their entire existence. Hard work, slow work, the kind that wasn't dramatic and couldn't be rushed. Damien had spent 22 years with Sebastian making things look easier than they were. He was developing a preference for letting things be as hard as they actually were. He found Vivian on the building's 32nd floor, in a room he hadn't been in before, smaller than the governance chamber, with windows facing east and a table with 2 chairs, and the evidence of someone who spent significant time here, annotated documents, A coffee cup that had been refilled enough times to leave a ring on the table, a specific quality of organized habitation. She was at the window when he came in, looking out at a city that was doing what cities do in the morning, moving, indifferent, carrying its own concerns forward without reference to the things that had happened in its infrastructure over the past 72 hours. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "You can come in," she said, without turning around. "I heard the elevator." He came in and stood beside her at the window. For a while, neither of them said anything. The city moved below them. The sky was doing something complicated with light. The particular early morning negotiation between darkness and day that didn't resolve cleanly, but shifted, gradually, without announcing the moment of change. "I've been thinking about the boardroom," Damien said. She didn't respond immediately. Waited. "I've been thinking about what I said, what I chose to do and how I chose to do it." He looked out at the city rather than at her. "I've been trying to find a version of it where my reasons were not good, but at least more complicated than they were. Some version where I was acting on something real rather than on 20 years of Sebastian's patient work on my worst qualities. Did you find one?" "No." She was quiet. "I signed those papers in front of 53 people," he said, "because I wanted 53 people to see me do it, because I thought it demonstrated something about me that I wanted demonstrated. And Sebastian knew I would want that, and he gave me the room and the audience, and I walked in and did exactly what he needed me to do without asking one question." He paused. "You could have warned me. I know why you didn't. I understand why you didn't. But you had to watch me do it anyway." Vivian turned from the window. She looked at him the way she had looked at him across the server room floor. Directly, without management, with the full unreduced weight of what she actually saw. "The first 2 years," she said, "I kept accounts. Every time you dismissed something I said in a room full of people. Every time you credited a decision to someone else that I had worked on. Every time Sebastian said something to you about me and I watched you absorb it without question." She stopped. "I kept accounts because that's what I knew how to do. Because accounting for things is how I was taught to manage situations I couldn't control." "And then?" "And then I stopped." She held his gaze. "Because keeping accounts was making me into someone who was waiting for you to fail so the accounts would be validated, and I didn't want to be that person." Damien was quiet. "Why did you stay?" he asked. Not combatively. It was a real question, with real weight, the kind you only ask when you've gotten past the version of it that's actually about your own need for reassurance. She looked at him for a long moment. "Because you were worth protecting," she said. "Not always easy to protect. Not always worth being around, but worth protecting." She paused. "There's a difference. I needed a long time to understand the difference, and by the time I understood it, the protecting had become its own kind of commitment that existed independent of everything else." "That's not the same as love," he said carefully. "No," she agreed. "It isn't. Not by itself." The city moved below them. Light shifted in the windows. "It wasn't only that," she said after a moment, quieter. "I want to be accurate. It wasn't only strategic commitment or professional obligation or the inertia of 7 years of shared infrastructure." She looked away from him, back at the window. You've always had something that Sebastian spent 20 years trying to use and never managed to destroy. Some fundamental quality that isn't the pride and isn't the ego and isn't the operational confidence. Something underneath those that made me believe for 7 years that if the noise was ever cleared away..." She stopped. "Vivian." "Don't ask me to finish that sentence right now," she said. "I'm not ready to finish it." He looked at her profile, the specific set of her jaw, the hand at her side that had resumed its small movement, thumb across 2 fingers, back and forth. And he understood now what that meant, what it had always meant, and he didn't find it controlled or distant anymore. He found it human in a way that 22 years of watching people perform emotion had made him forget to look for. "Okay," he said. They stood at the window. Below them, the city resolved itself incrementally into full daylight. Traffic accumulated. The first commuters moved across intersections with the habitual forward lean of people who had places to be. Somewhere down there, in the financial district's ordinary morning, people were beginning workdays that had nothing to do with any of this. Breakfasts eaten, messages sent, the 10,000 ordinary commitments of ordinary lives moving forward in the unremarkable way that lives move forward when large things have passed through and left them standing. The consortium's review board convenes in 3 weeks, Vivian said. Her voice had returned to its professional register, but without the managed quality it had carried for so long. The management was still there. It was part of how she was built, but the distance behind it was thinner. The integration framework that Hargrove is drafting will need your organizational records for the past 6 years, everything Garrison has. He'll send it today. And the Eastern Logistics team, the 3 who went quiet. Before any formal arrangement moves forward, I need to know where their allegiances actually are. I'll talk to them myself. She glanced at him. Something in it that was not quite a question. Not to convince them, he said. To ask. And then to tell you what they say, and let you make whatever assessment you make. He paused. I understand that's how this has to work. I'm not asking for authority I haven't earned. The glance held a moment longer. That's new, she said. Yes, he said. It is. Another silence. This one different from the others. Not filled with what wasn't being said, but with what was being allowed to settle into the space without being rushed or managed or filed under something else. The 12 cars are still at the estate, Damien said. I know. I'll arrange to have them moved. Don't, he said. She looked at him. Leave them, he said. I want to see them every morning. As a I don't know. Not a trophy. The opposite of a trophy. He thought about how to say it. A reminder that I signed papers in a boardroom and thought I understood what I was doing, and 12 cars arrived 20 minutes later to tell me I didn't understand anything. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time in 72 hours, for possibly the first time in longer than that, in some real way, something in her face that wasn't composure or calculation or the management of everything she carried. Something that was simply a response to being in the same room with another person and finding the room, against reasonable expectation, unexpectedly bearable. Not a smile exactly. The territory adjacent to one, the thing that lives there when the situation doesn't quite allow for what it's reaching toward, but reaches anyway. Leave them, she agreed. Outside, the day had fully arrived. Without ceremony. Without announcement. Just the gradual, undeniable accumulation of light that doesn't ask permission and doesn't wait for anyone to be ready. Damien's arm needed attention he hadn't fully given it. There were 3 weeks of reconstruction work ahead before the review board convened, and then the board itself, and then whatever came after that. The long, unspectacular labor of building something honest from materials that had mostly been used for other purposes. Nothing about any of it was going to be clean or easy or free of the residue of 22 years of choices made in the wrong direction. But Vivian was standing at the window in the morning light, and she had not told him to leave, and in 31 hours she had protected him from a seized port and a compromised governance structure, and a 70-year-old man who had spent 3 decades building toward the destruction of everything she had inherited, and she had done all of it without once asking him to acknowledge what it cost. He was going to spend a considerable amount of time making sure she didn't have to carry things alone anymore. Not because he owed it to her. Debt was the wrong frame, and he was done with the wrong frames. Because the strongest person he had ever known was standing 12 inches away from him, and she had a habit of pressing her thumb against 2 fingers when she was working through something she hadn't resolved yet. And he had spent 7 years looking at that and not seeing it, and he was not going to spend another 7 years the same way. He turned from the window. Tell me what needs to happen today, he said. She looked at him once more, direct, clear, the full weight of 7 years and 72 hours, and everything between them visible in it without apology. Then she picked up the annotated documents from the table, and she told him. And he listened.